Welcome to GV247.tv, the Global Vision Channel, a non-profit web TV channel bringing biblical perspective to the world in which you live.
Hello and welcome to this week's weekend programme. We've got something a bit different for you. But on top of that, I would like to say welcome to Channel 25, Focus on Israel, because this week we're doing a 2-for-1. And I have a special guest in the studio with me, and this Tricia Miller, PhD. Tricia, welcome. It's absolutely lovely to have you on the programme. And you're here today because you're going to tell us not just a bit about yourself, but about Camera. And I know you're based in the USA at the moment, and normally I have communications with your UK rep. But what I'd like you to do, first of all, Tricia, is just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then about Camera, what it's all about, what you do, and who you do it for. So, Tricia, over to you.
Well, thank you, Deborah. It's good to be here. It's really good to meet you. I thank Christina for introducing us. I'm the director of Camera's Partnership of Christians and Jews. So first, let me tell you what Camera is. Camera, it's an acronym. It stands for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. It was founded in 1982 at the time of the First Lebanese War, when the media was just, being horrible about the way they were talking about what was going on between Lebanon and Israel. So it's founded as a media watch organization. It's now grown to an international organization. We monitor the media in English and Hebrew and Spanish and Arabic. So we're pretty much covering most of the world. We have a big campus department with outreach on campuses, helping students fight anti-Semitism on campus and stand for Israel. An education department that's looking at all the curriculum in public schools, which is very anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And we have the Christian department. That's what I'm the director of. And we call the work that I do, it goes under the name of the Partnership of Christians and Jews. And what we do, what the partnership does, is fight anti-Semitism in the Christian world in general, but specifically in the evangelical Christian world, because I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm also a credentialed minister. So I'm very concerned about what's going on in the Christian world in relation to anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, and the opposition to Israel's right to exist. So what else I do is that we provide a powerful response to what is unfortunately a growing effort to turn evangelical support away from Israel. There's quite a movement. It's been building for 20 to 30 years. It's based on lies, it's based on bad theology, but to try to turn the evangelical support away from Israel, because evangelicals have historically been pro-Israel, because evangelicals are the part of Christendom who are most likely to actually read their Bible, know what the Bible says. When you actually read the Bible and look at what God says about his heart for the Jewish people and for Israel, and what all the Hebrew prophets have said about how God will return his people to the land. If you read the Bible and you understand all that, then obviously you're going to be supportive of Israel. Because as Christians, if we say we love God, how can we not love who God loves and love what God is doing in these end times, really? I mean, what we're seeing is the fulfillment of all the Hebrew prophets in our lives. We get to see this, that the Jews literally are being brought back from the four corners of the world to Israel. So that's my focus, is making sure, strengthening evangelical support for Israel and countering the lies, the bad theology that supports trying to turn that away. And then also, as our name indicates, we're the Partnership of Christians and Jews. We're actually focused too on building a very important partnership between Christians and Jews. That relationship has been broken over the centuries, over the millennium, really back to the early church, again, rooted in bad theology. And so in the last 40, 50 years, saw that warming up a little bit. And especially in the last couple of decades, just really great progress being made at building Christians and Jews together. So, as I said, I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm a minister, and as you said, I have a PhD in Hebrew Bible. So I just want to tell you a little bit about how I got into this, because people usually ask, why do I care? And actually, my interest in this work and the preparation for what I'm doing, it's rooted in a lifetime of experience and learning. And it began with a transforming encounter I had with Corrie ten Boom when I was 20. And in case somebody who's listening doesn't know who Corrie ten Boom was, I know you know, but she was one of only a few survivors of her extended Christian family who lived in Amsterdam during World War II. And because of their biblical understanding of God's heart and calling for the Jewish people, the Ten Boom family and an extended network, they took actions that resulted in the saving of over 800 Jews during the Holocaust. They built a hiding place in a little space behind a closet in Corey's bedroom. You're nodding, Deborah. Have you been there? Okay. It was large enough for just, like, so they said, 6 people to stand closely together. And I fulfilled a lifetime dream just a few years ago and finally got to get there and stand in that space. But from that home, they smuggled Jews out of Nazi Europe through an underground network of safe houses. They were eventually betrayed, everyone in the home and those who worked with them, and they were all sent to concentration camps. Corey's the only one of her immediate family who survived, and she was released from the camp due to a clerical error, because the week after she was released, they gassed all the women her age. All the women her age went to the gas chamber. So that meeting that I had with her, I heard her speak and got to talk with her. That just changed my life. It's one of those moments in life. It changed my life. And I knew from that point on what the direction and purpose of my life was to stand with the Jewish people and do whatever I could to help keep them safe. So I began a long process of studying the Holocaust because, okay, I heard Corey's story from that side of it, but I had never really heard much in school, didn't know what really happened, what happened to the Jews. Corey's story included that, but also included her side of the story. So I started studying church history and Christian theology because what drove me was, how did this happen in a so-called Christian country? What was wrong with the Christians? Because I grew up in a very philo-Semitic home, a pro-Israel home. I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, and where literally about half the population is Jewish. So we all had Jewish friends. I thought we all got along. I didn't know that there was any such history between Jews and Christians. So that's what drove me. That's what keeps driving me. My concern for what is wrong with Christians, and I don't know whether any other tactful way to say it. I'm not sounding very tactful, but what is wrong with Christians who won't stand with the Jewish people and who can actually be anti-Semitic? Because if we understand our faith, we worship and serve a Jewish Messiah. Jesus is Jewish. He grew up in a Jewish context. He was an observant Jew. His followers called him rabbi, et cetera, et cetera. And so how can we not love his natural brother? He had natural relatives through Mary, right? So how can we not love his natural relatives? So anyway, I went on this quest to learn church history and theology to understand this. And so that led me to, I got a master's in theology at a seminary, then I did my PhD. And I did it on the book of Esther. The PhD is in Hebrew Bible, so I had to do something from the Hebrew Bible. I did it from Esther because it's the story of an attempted genocide of the Jews. And there's some real anti-Semitism going on there when you understand the story of why Haman was motivated to do what he did. But the dissertation allowed me to look at the history of Christian anti-Semitism by looking at the history of Christian interpretation of Esther, which is pretty anti-Semitic. Christian scholars throughout the centuries have despised the book of Esther. They think it's just this gory story of how Jews love to kill people and then have a party and eat, which is not what's going on at all in the story. So later, if you want to If you want to talk about Esther, we can talk about Esther. But so that's really a bit of how I got into this. But what I really believe after studying the church in Germany and the German theology that the German churches were based on, and that Hitler used. The Nazis were in no way Christians, obviously, but they knew how to use the church to manipulate the church, to quote heroes of the German church, like, unfortunately, like Martin Luther. And I just have to stop and say Martin Luther did a lot of good. Anybody who's Protestant is really thankful for the work Martin Luther did. In a lot of ways, but towards the end of his life, he became very, very nasty, hostile, anti-Semitic, and wrote horrible things about the Jews, which the Nazis used to get the churches in line. So the German church really failed. I mean, that's such an understatement, but I don't know how else to say it. They failed. They didn't do what they needed to have done. They should have stood up, but they didn't do it for a number of reasons, historical and theological.
If you would continue telling us a little bit more about how the German church was persuaded to see things the way they did. And, for anybody out there who's never, for example, even visited the likes of Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, when you see the PR that was put out there by the Nazis, and remember, please don't call them Germans, viewers. They were Nazis. There was a particular brand. So, Tricia, if you could give us some, just an outline of how was the German church, and I know it wasn't all of them, but how was the church and the people in general, how were they persuaded that Jews were the enemy? So we'll take a look at that first before we come on to replacement theology. Can you give us an outline, please?
Again, I have to say, I'm sorry. It really started with Martin Luther, who was 400 years before the Nazis. But I did extensive research on everything he wrote, and then the history of the German theologians for those 400 years, they kept building on it. So for 400 years, you have this entrenched in German church theology that the Jews are cursed, that God he hates them. Martin Luther wrote a book called On the Jews and Their Lies. And I really encourage people, it's nauseating reading. As you said, some of the stuff you saw, it's nauseating, the things that he said about the Jews, but he outlined in that booklet that he wrote how he thought the Jews should be treated. And it included everything the Nazis did to the Jews except gas chambers, because Martin Luther couldn't, he couldn't conceive of gas chambers, but everything they did to expel them, to not allow them to teach, to throw them out, don't give them safe passage on the roads, burn all their books, put them into camps, make them labor, hard labor. It's exactly what was done in the concentration camps. So you have 400 years of this just despising Jews as being part of the German church DNA. And that wasn't all the churches, as you said. There were churches who stood up. There was a pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for one, who stood up. Martin Niemöller. There were good pastors, but they were not the majority. And so what drove me to, figure out why, I had to go back and learn this history, study everything Martin Luther wrote, and understand how that fed the German church's hostility. But in some cases, they weren't all hostile. They were just apathetic. Christians were apathetic, complacent. So the other thing I do in my work is to point out how we can't be complacent. We can't just look the other way and act like nothing's happening. So we can't be complacent. We can't be apathetic. But most importantly, we have to understand what God says about the Jews and the future of Israel, and that God has a plan for the Jewish people that is clear all the way through the end of Revelation. And that has not all been fulfilled yet. God has not abandoned the Jewish people.
We've made a couple of several documentaries and even a movie, a film our first one was Cup of Trembling, Countdown to Armageddon. Very dramatic title, but the idea behind it was actually to teach Christians an outline of eschatology and the study of the end things regarding Bible prophecy, because at that time there were very few students of eschatology, very few people who spoke about it. There were the well-known names over in the United States and very few in the UK. So we did that, and the first half of it was about the veracity of the Bible, the manuscripts, the Hebrew, the Greek, and so on and so forth. And the second half is looking at, well, what does it say? And if we see that the accuracy of the fulfillment of prophecy in the first time that Jesus came, then we can be sure, we can be fairly certain that the second time he comes, it will be just as accurate. And began a tremendous journey for my husband and I, in Israel, going all over the world, interviewing people. We updated it with another one called the Daniel Project again, but this one was for the unsaved. It was for the world. It was a secular production. The first one was for the church. So the second one was made for television. It's still on Amazon at the moment, Amazon Prime, I believe, in the UK, the US, I don't know what other countries. And we have a problem here, Tricia, in the UK. I don't know if you have it in the US, for example, where we have what's known as messianic believers. So real Jews who have recognized Yeshua as Jesus as their Messiah. And there can be a problem where they can't always get that dividing line between being under law and being under grace. So there's all kinds of little challenges there. So we're going to come back to the subject of replacement theology again.
Let me go back to the beginning. It actually, replacement theology started in the early church, really in the 2nd century. However, the Apostle Paul must have seen it developing, or just knew in the spirit that he needed to write about it, because in Romans 9 through 11, there is a detailed treatise from Paul. I encourage everyone to study Romans 9 through 11, his letter to the Romans. It's a detailed explanation of God's heart for the Jewish people, where the Jewish people fit in God's plan. And he even asks, has God rejected his people? No. And it's an emphatic. In the Greek, it's a very, very emphatic no. And keep in mind the context of Romans. Paul is writing to believers in Rome. The new believers in Rome at that point probably had never met a Jewish person, because the Jews had been expelled from Rome at that point. So Paul is having to educate new Gentile believers who the Jewish people are even, and why they matter to God. But it's a very strong argument against replacement theology before it had really taken place in the church. But in Romans 11, he says, don't do it. Don't be arrogant. Don't stumble. And he uses the analogy of the olive tree. It says Israel is the root of that tree. And you Gentile believers, you're just wild branches that have been grafted in. The Jewish people are the natural branches who belong in that tree. We're just wild branches grafted in. Those are Paul's words. So the church didn't, by the next century, Paul was writing in the 1st century, obviously. By the next century, church leaders were already starting to teach that God he's done away with the Jews. He's fed up with the Jews because they rejected Jesus. They're no longer part of God's plan. And so the theology developed that we now call replacement theology. They didn't call it that, but what they were teaching is God has replaced the Jews with the Christians. The Jews are replaced in the purposes of God, and Israel is replaced by the church in the purposes of God. God has no further purpose for the nation of Israel. And they used as, proof of their position that the temple was destroyed in 70 by the Romans, and the Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem. And so that's evidence of God's judgment on them, and they're never coming back. Well, they weren't reading any of the Hebrew prophets. because in every single Hebrew prophet, it's very, very explicit about how God's going to bring them back and that there will be no more exiles, because that was the second exile. First was under the Babylonians with the destruction of the first temple. The second exile was under the Romans with the destruction of the second temple. But there's no more exiles. It's very, very clear when you read all the prophets. And it says God will bring them back from the four corners of the earth. So that, if I can jump ahead a little bit, because that is what feeds into the current Christian anti-Zionism. The Christians who are opposed to the existence of Israel because it's messing with their theology. They just can't accept it because it's the fulfillment of all the Hebrew prophets. God is obviously blessing Israel, even though Israel is a secular state, but God is blessing them. And the Christians who just can, have to hold on to replacement theology can't accept it. So they have to keep fighting it.
Back to the world and the secular press. Israel, with all its great technology, ought to have the very best PR. And yet somehow the Palestinian authorities, the whole pro-Palestinian lobby, seems to shout a whole lot louder.
And the reason is, I think, is that Israel is so focused on doing good, building up the country, all of the research, developing new things, inventing things, helping the world. They genuinely know that their calling is to be a light to the world. They know that. Even the secular Jews know that the Jewish people were called to be a light to the world. Even secular Jews believe that Abraham is their father, and God called Abraham, and the Jewish people are to be a light to the world. And even a secular Jew will go, they'll put their life on the line to help anybody, anywhere. They have this as a part of them, and they love life. On the other hand, the Palestinian Authority's primary objective in existing is to destroy Israel. That's their focus. That's what they spend all their time on. They love death. And, countless Israeli leaders have said, if the Arabs would start loving their children, they would stop, sending them to die again, killing us. But that's the whole objective of the Palestinian movement, is to kill Jews, wipe Israel off the map. That's their focus. So they spend all of their time creating the lies, spreading the propaganda, whereas Israel's not focused, they're focused on life and positive things and not countering that.
What's the story with the Palestinian Christians?
So what's really happening to Christians under the Palestinian Authority is that they're being persecuted by the Arab leadership. It's Arabs persecuting Christians, Muslims persecuting Christians. It's not because Israel is doing something to harm the Christian population, because in Israel proper, the Christian population is growing and growing and growing. Israel is the only place in the Middle East where Christians are free to worship, where the government, the Jewish government, protects Christians' right to worship, protects the Christian holy places. And I have an article that I've written recently that is about how this battle between the Christian anti-Israel narrative and what the facts are. So the fact that the Christian population in Israel should tell you everything. Christians want to live in Israel. They're fleeing the Palestinian Authority.
Something I've come upon in my travels, particularly in the media or making documentaries and going to various film festivals, I do meet Palestinian producers and directors and so on, and I listen to their tales, and there's no doubt about it, there's an element of fear there. Can you address that side of things at all?
I talked about how the Christians are persecuted by the Palestinian Authority. The Muslim population is also intimidated. Some of them do have very hard lives. It is not easy to live under the Palestinian Authority. And so far in my comments, I've only focused on what the leadership is saying, the Christian Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority's leadership. That does not, it's very good to make a distinction between the leadership and the people themselves. There are a lot of Palestinian people who would just love to be able to live in peace And in fact, they do work with Israelis. There is a lot of coexistence that the media will never cover. There are communities in Judea and Samaria, especially, where there's Palestinians and Israelis working side by side. However, if you're to ask them a question, they're not going to, they're not going to necessarily want to tell you what they really think, because there's a lot of fear and intimidation by the Palestinian Authority, and anything that they say that's against the Palestinian Authority can definitely be used against them or their family members. Persecution is not just for the Christians. Persecution by the Palestinian Authority or the leadership is against anyone who stands against them. So that's a very important distinction to make. So far, everything I was saying was I was talking about the leadership, but the people, a lot of the people really live in peace with the Israelis. They want to live in peace, and they even work. They will go into Israel to get jobs because they get so much better jobs there. So that's a whole nother part of the picture.
Tricia, we've been talking about what's known as the Palestinian territories, and there are still a few Christians left there. I don't know how many Christian schools there are. What is the situation there? Because, I've been getting mixed messages from, people we've supported over there for a long time over in Israel. And I'm hearing so many stories where even at the Christian schools now, there are Muslim children. Some of them, some of the stories going out is that these children don't have parents or they're orphans. What do you know about that, Tricia?
Let me go back. A little while ago, we talked about replacement theology, which is the belief that the church and Christians have replaced Israel and the Jews in the purposes of God, right? The Palestinian Christian leaders, I also want to make a disclaimer. There are Palestinian Christians who understand what the Word of God says about the Jewish people and Israel, and they are not in this category, okay? There are some very good, I'm not going to name names though. They suffer a lot of persecution for their stand, but they are very pro-Israel because they understand what the Bible says. So there's two groups. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the Palestinian Christians fall into the other group where they're very anti-Semitic, very anti-Israel, and it's because of their own version of replacement theology and rewritten history. They claim that the Palestinian people are the indigenous people of the land, that there were no Jews in the land 2,000 years ago. The Jews who are there now are European settlers. They're colonizers from Europe. They just came in the last couple hundred years. There's a classic quote by a pastor named Mitri Rahab. He's the Lutheran pastor of the Bethlehem Church, the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. And he said, I don't have the quote in front of me, so this is a paraphrase, okay, so it's not exact. But he said, if you were to compare his DNA and Jesus's DNA, that there would be a match. But if you compared Netanyahu's DNA with Jesus's, there wouldn't be any match, because Netanyahu is one of those colonizers from Europe. What they've done is completely rewrite history to fit their narrative. They are claiming that they are the indigenous people. They have the right to be there. They're being oppressed by these evil Jews who just came a couple hundred years ago, then they'll say, just like the Jews oppressed Jesus. Okay, now catch this. On one hand, they're saying there were no Jews in the land 2,000 years ago because they're discrediting Jewish history to the land, Jewish history. But on the other side, they accuse the Jews of persecuting Jesus, and these Jews are now persecuting them, the brothers of Jesus. So when you start lying, it gets complicated, right? Both cannot be true. Either the Jews were there 2,000 years ago or they were not. Both can't be true. But what also happens theologically with this rewritten narrative is that they're rewriting the New Testament. Well, they're rewriting the whole Bible, but especially look at the New Testament. Start with Matthew 1, the genealogy of Jesus. It's very clear in the genealogy of Jesus, he's very Jewish. He's completely Jewish, totally Jewish. And then all of the Gospels all talk about all these events that happened in Jesus's life. He's obviously in that land. He went to the temple, et cetera, et cetera. He preached in synagogues, just read the Gospels. What they're doing is denying all of that. So in the name of their faith, they're claiming to be Christians doing this. They're saying Jesus wasn't Jewish, because that's the logical. If there were no Jews in the land when Jesus was born, he can't be Jewish. That's their logical conclusion. But the problem is it's not true. So Mitri Rahab is one of the leaders who has promoted this just diabolical narrative that Christians are believing if they are not reading their Bibles. These Palestinian Christian leaders are very good at using their Christianese and sounding like and playing on people's sympathies, because they play the persecuted victim role. And there's these, overpowerful Jews that are dominating them. The other place that this is really coming from, this narrative has been coming from, is Bethlehem Bible College. They claim it's an evangelical school. And you talk about Christian school, you mentioned Christian schools. It's an evangelical, their identification of themselves is even, I mean, obviously I would have an issue with this, but evangelical school. And before COVID, they had a Christ at the Checkpoint conference every other year that they sponsored. They've had another one since COVID, but they're thankfully, at least COVID shut that down, where people come from all over the world, but primarily the United States, and significant Christian leaders from the United States gone to these Christ at the Checkpoint conferences and hear this completely skewed narrative. It's based on replacement theology and their own, I call it the Palestinian version of replacement theology, because the Palestinians, have replaced the Jews in the purposes of God, according to their story. They're the indigenous people. They're the ones being persecuted by Jews now, et cetera, et cetera. So Christian leaders have come back, major Christian leaders of mega churches that have extensive ministries, around the world. They come back with this narrative, and so it's being promoted to way too many Christians in the West. And that's my primary focus of the work, is countering the lies. It's theologically and historically inaccurate. And it's even inaccurate based on current events. I mean, they tell stories of what Jews have done that are not true, that they have no substance at all. And it's going on. It's very alarming what's going on in the evangelical world, but it's also continuing in the mainline churches. And just recently, there was a horrible article published about the head of the Catholic Church in Jerusalem. And I wrote an article about that. I can summarize some of that to give you a current example of what happens in the media, because media is what camera deals with, and Christian media specifically. What's going on in the church, it's just horrendous, but the lies are only increasing and being amplified.
Could you give us a couple of examples of what's going on here in the Christian church?
My article is titled Anti-Jewish Libels Resurrected by Christian Clergy in Jerusalem. And I use that word resurrected because they're supposed to be celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, but they're resurrecting anti-Jewish libels, essentially what has historically been known as blood libels, where over the centuries the Jews have been accused of all kinds of stuff, murders, all kinds of stuff that are not true. We don't have time to go into that. But I detailed the 3 examples that they gave of the attacks on Christian property. I have quotes. If I'll tell you where to find the article if you want to read it, because it's too long to go through now. But I detailed everything that was false about their accusations. And I also pointed out that they didn't give any evidence for any of their accusations. So one of their accusations is that this is happening at an alarming rate. It's increasing, and it's because it's the current government supports it. And they don't do anything about it. And the police don't do anything about it. So I have quotes in here from the police, from their tweets, from their offices of what they've done. They responded immediately. Yeah, there's fanatics, there's fringe people everywhere, in every religion. And yes, there were some Jews who attacked 3 properties, but the police were right on it immediately. The perpetrators have been arrested, they've been prosecuted. Whereas in this article, and what this Latin patriarch is saying is that the police, the government doesn't do anything about it. It's all lies, but the tendency of people is to believe what comes out first. And it's hard to counteract lies. You know, that somebody said, was it Mark Twain? Somebody said a lie can travel around the world before the truth has time to get their pants on, or something like that, because it takes time. You can just tell a lie and it's out there. It takes time to do the research I did and substantiate it and write this article to counter it. So people need to go. I'll just put in a plug here for the Camera website. My article is published on the Camera website. If you go to the Camera website, you can search for under authors' names, and you can also search under subject titles, and you'll find it. The name of this article is Anti-Jewish Libels Resurrected by Christian Clergy in Jerusalem. But I also published the article on Israel 365 News, which is a fantastic website. This is a whole service that was started by Rabbi Tuli Wise in Israel. And this website has international exposure. So the word is out, and actually there was a plethora of articles for about a month on this subject, of people saying, oh, the Jews are attacking Christians, and it's all the time, and it's growing, and the government's not doing anything about it. And after this article was published, that's all, it's died down. So it helps. You have to get the truth out, but lies are hard to fight. But I just want to encourage the audience to look for the truth. Do your research. Don't believe the first thing that comes out. Do your research. Look for reliable sources. And Israel 365 News is a reliable source. Camera is a reliable source. So look for reliable sources to get the facts.
Thank you, Tricia, because that's what we're all about here, both at Global Vision TV and at Bethel Communications. Tricia, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us today. And what I'm hoping is that we could perhaps do this a little more regularly, if you keep us updated with your with the stories, so that we can help share them. I'm certainly happy to carry your articles as well, Tricia. For any other Christians, so you're in the US, we have viewers all over the world. We have, and I know the contact here in the UK, Christina, and of course there's the Hebrew, Arabic, German. Do you have it in German or is it Italian? I can't remember.
Spanish.
Thank you, Tricia. We will certainly provide that information. We'll put it in down below in the description, whichever social media people are watching this on. But at the moment, Tricia, I'd like to say thank you very much. We would like to come back to you if that's okay, and find out a lot more. So and you've already given us your website, and I'll put a note to that, and we'll carry on with that the next time we see you. So thank you very much again, Tricia. It's been lovely.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
This is GV247.tv, bringing biblical perspective to the world in which you live. A powerful free resource with hundreds of short films on a wide range of Bible topics from experts around the world, plus full-length sermons and programs for teaching and encouragement. Choose from current affairs, signs of the times, a chance to voice your own opinion, and special offers on our full-length feature films, documentaries, and study materials. At over 4 hours in length, the Lamplight Project is a systematic 12-part Bible study series, a powerful teaching tool that begins with the origins of life and takes the viewer on a comprehensive journey packed with high-profile interviews, film, graphics, and illustrations, concluding with the return of Christ and an encouragement to stand firm and be faithful. Complete with a free study guide download for both personal and group study, this powerful interactive guide connects to over 1,000 programs with expert interviews on GV247.tv our free service web TV channel. Does My Life Have Meaning? A powerful 1-hour presentation produced from the Lamplight Project. With a free copy of the Gospel of Luke, this film is crammed with engaging interviews, film and graphics. A life-challenging film to those searching for answers. As distributors for the Jesus film, we offer this timeless movie based on Luke's Gospel. This clear presentation of the life of Jesus Christ has been viewed worldwide and translated into over 1,200 languages. We provide the film with a free copy of the Gospel of Luke. The Daniel Project is a popular TV documentary that presents an overview of Bible prophecy and an encouragement to read the signs of the times. Hailed as one of the best TV films to be made on the subject, DVD extras feature a heart-to-heart interview about the way of rescue. Based loosely on the documentary, The Daniel Connection is a full-length feature film. This fictional thriller incorporates many of the themes promoted through pop culture and social media which affect people on a global scale. Launched at the Cannes Film Festival, The Daniel Connection points the ever-skeptical viewer to search the Bible for answers to life's deepest questions. We've been serving the body of Christ for over 30 years, and if you would like further information, please do not hesitate to get in touch.